Ohio University scientist and professor Jared DeForest has received funding from the National Science Foundation to study climate change in 2 Ohio forests. How Dr. DeForest is doing this and why are 2 questions we'll get answers for as he joins us now in our studio. Thanks for being here this evening.
Great to be here.
Now let's start with the why question. Why are you studying climate change in Ohio forests?
Well, when we talk about climate change, a lot of people think of things like temperature and moisture, but climate also is things like acid rain. So human activities can be altering the type of materials fall down, and that can affect life, it can affect plants, that has a cascading effect that can also influence other animals and things like that, and the ecosystem services they provide.
Okay. So what 2 forests are you looking at, and why those 2 in particular?
Okay, so I have some common forests. These are like blue-collar forests that we have in Ohio. We have some local in Athens, Ohio, but these are on very old soils. They're weathered soils. It hasn't been changed by disturbance in basically thousands and thousands, well, tens of thousands of years. I do have some plots up at near northern Ohio, and these are on unglaciated soils, okay? And these things are actually young soils, and what I'm trying to understand is how climate change changes depending on soil type, young versus old soil. The idea is that climate change is not going to affect, or acid rain is not going to affect all forests the same. And this is kind of a way to try to figure out, is there a difference between the 2, or do they behave the same?
Okay. And when did you start your research, and what have you learned so far from it?
Well, I started the experiment back in 2009, and actually it required me of putting down massive amounts of lime. This is limestone to the soil, and the idea is to raise the soil pH, and I added phosphorus to that. So it's been going on for 3 years now, and we're starting to get some really interesting results.
Okay. How are you conducting your study, and what's the timetable for it?
The timetable for the study? Well, this is, we have 4 years for this project. I have another year to go, but I set this project up to basically last 10, 20 years. Once we initially started everything, we'll keep on going. So it began with just trying to understand soil microbes, because those are the first responders to climate change. They're going to react immediate to that. Now we're starting to see this plant effect. We're starting to see these plants taken to these treatments, and what we're finding is that there's this idea that most plants are limited by nitrogen, and now we're thinking that they're limited by phosphorus. And that's a big deal, because there's this assumption that most plants are limited by nitrogen and not phosphorus. So it's kind of almost a paradigm shift in the way that we look at climate change on these forests.
Okay. How will your research be used when you're all done with it?
Well, the idea is once we're getting into it's basically to develop other hypotheses, other ideas. So I began with this, how does it affect these soil microbes, things that we can't even see. Now we're seeing this plant effect. Well, what does this mean? I'm actually finding that the soils that we have down here are very sensitive to basically acid rain, let's say. But the soils up north, they're insensitive to these treatments. So it seems like if we're looking at the effects of climate change on different forest types, it seems like the older the soils they are, the more sensitive they are, whereas other ecosystems might be less sensitive. So this could be used by policymakers to understand what areas are more sensitive to climate change than others.
All right then, well, Dr. DeForest, thank you for joining us tonight.
Great to be here.